A few months ago, we did a video on PewDiePie's take on Nietzsche. And in PewDiePie's video, he's talking about Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence of the same, and how that means for him, which is a valid interpretation, that you affirm life and that you can imagine every single moment of it returning again and again, and that you're kind of fine with that. And in order to give an example for such a moment, PewDiePie referred to his wedding dance. I made the following comment on this. And then he gives a kind of half corny example about his wedding where he was dancing with his wife, maybe a little bit to please the female audience.
During my wedding, when I was dancing with Marcia, I felt, as being surrounded by my family, I had this moment of feeling like, you know what, whatever my life turns to, at least I had this moment.
Quite a few viewers were not happy with this comment. There were lots of critical remarks on it. I'm just quoting two here. Chopperman says, why does him mentioning his wedding dance have to be pandering to his female audience? Is it that strange to think a man can cherish that moment just as much as his wife probably does? Very off comment. And then Isabella Rose says, why would PewDiePie mention his happiness at his wedding to please the female audience? Why is being corny for the women? And why can't we assume that PewDiePie honestly felt moved and deeply happy during that moment and is not afraid to share that unironically? Now, these two comments, representing many others, just express, I'm afraid, a misunderstanding of what I said. Number one, the comments imply that I, wrongly as they think, accused PewDiePie of somehow being dishonest about this moment, as if he didn't really enjoy the moment. I did not say this. And secondly, some viewers interpreted this as some kind of sexism, that I would be somehow reproducing negative, false stereotypes about women, which also I don't think I did. I think both criticisms are philosophically relevant misunderstandings of what I said. And I want to address them through discussing three issues. Number one, why is PewDiePie's wedding dance actually not a good example to illustrate Nietzsche's idea of the affirmation of life and of the eternal return? And in this context, why is it also, from a Nietzschean perspective, half corny? In order to do this, I will talk about Nietzsche's views on weddings and Nietzsche's philosophy of marriage. Then, secondly, why my guess about female audiences? So I want to discuss this by talking about weddings and media. And then number three, most importantly, is PewDiePie's remark on weddings, or in his wedding, dishonest, which I didn't say. And in order to address this issue, I'm going to talk about weddings and sincerity and profilicity. That's going to be the most important part of the video. Now, first, Nietzsche on weddings and his philosophy of marriage. Unlike PewDiePie, Nietzsche would probably not have chosen a wedding or his wedding as an illustration for a moment that illustrates the affirmation of life. It's a very un-Nietzschean choice. Number one, Nietzsche was unmarried. Number two, if you look into his now published correspondence, you find that he was rather frequently a little bit stressed out about weddings. It just made him worry what to give. I quote here, translated into English, from a letter he wrote to Franziska and Elisabeth Nietzsche. And I just replaced, for the sake of highlighting the effect, the person of the wedding he was invited to with PewDiePie's name, which obviously is not in the original letter. So Nietzsche writes in this letter, something has to be figured out as wedding gift to the famous and much celebrated PewDiePie. But about this, you need to inspire me. So secondly, weddings just more often than not made him worried what to give. And then thirdly, several times in his correspondence, he writes about that he was being somehow annoyed by a wedding invitation and tried to somehow get around it. So this is one here. Quote, he writes, about the same time as the departure of my trip to you, there will be PewDiePie's wedding here. I'm fleeing from this event. So Nietzsche was not that huge a fan of weddings. And I think this has to be seen in the context of his take on marriage. I'm going to read out three rather famous quotes on this. The first one from The Genealogy of Morals. The philosopher shudders mortally at marriage, together with all that could persuade him to. Marriage as a fatal hindrance on the way to the optimum. Up to the present, what great philosophers have been married? Heraclitus, Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, Schopenhauer. They were not married, and further, one cannot imagine them as married. A married philosopher belongs to comedy. That is my rule. And then from Human All to Human, free spirit and marriage. Will free thinkers live with women? In general, I think that like the prophesying birds of old, like the true thinkers and truth speakers of the present, they must prefer to fly alone. And then finally, from Beyond Good and Evil, even concubinage has been corrupted by marriage. So what Nietzsche says here is basically that marriage is not for free spirits like himself. Marriage is mostly, but not always, something very common for common people. In German, we have the word spießig. So it's for people different from free spirits who are small-minded, average people. In most, but not all cases, marriage is precisely not about the affirmation of life, of love, and of sexuality, but it's basically a corruption of all of these things through religious and political, social conventions. For Nietzsche, marriage is something, simply put, lame or mediocre or conventional. And in this sense, it's kind of half corny. Now, behind this is obviously the view of weddings as being rituals of what I like to call sincerity. That is, they express the conformity to social conventions. Only in very rare cases, according to Nietzsche, can people preserve or enhance their mutual authenticity within such a conventional framework. So basically what weddings do, they initiate people into a role-oriented life. They represent the submission to roles and the identification with such roles under a regime of sincerity. Second topic, weddings and media. So why did PewDiePie choose such an un-Nietzschean example of a wedding to make his point about the eternal return and of his understanding of what a moment is that he would relive eternally? Well, not simply, I'd say, because PewDiePie doesn't know Nietzsche, because he's not an expert. That's, I think, rather irrelevant. Much more important is that PewDiePie is a very successful YouTuber, one of the most famous YouTubers in the world. So everything he posts is more or less consciously addressed to a large audience. And everything is somehow vetted against how it performs and what kind of people it may attract and who it may not attract. I mean, even we consider this a lot before we post stuff. So weddings are a very popular theme on media, both on traditional media like TV, movie, even print media, as well as on new media, social media. So we have to consider that PewDiePie is actually always speaking to the masses and addressing mass audiences. Now, as it happens, and I somehow assumed viewers would be familiar with this, that weddings as media themes are frequently primarily addressed to female audiences. I quote here from a quite feminist article on weddings and reality television that I found on the internet. It's by Rosa, Giorgio. It's published a while ago, 2011, but I think it is still valid. So Rosa Giorgio writes, in a television-obsessed society, contemporary Americans have the freedom to watch over 1,500 different television channels that include hundreds of various reality television shows, 20% of which are wedding-themed. Such titles include A Wedding Story, Bridezillas, Bulging Brides, Platinum Weddings, My Big Fat Fabulous Wedding, Rich Bride, Poor Bride, Get Married, My Big Redneck Wedding, Whose Wedding Is It Anyway?, The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, and Married Away. She continues, I'm convinced that wedding reality shows are specifically aimed at entertaining young female audiences by showcasing the materialistic and self-centered side of marriage in an attempt to promote marriage and domesticity. Weddings are billion-dollar industries. And then, after carefully analyzing the questionnaire, the EETV website blogs, and watching the shows, I am convinced that wedding reality shows in general entice female viewers with the glitz and glamour of wedding celebrations while providing a false representation of marriage. They teach audience to identify themselves as princesses and beautiful girls that deserve a perfect fairy tale ending to their wedding day. So, going back to Isabella Rose's question, why would PewDiePie mention his happiness at his wedding to please the female audience? Well, because wedding-themed media presentations are typically a commodification of human relationships specifically targeted at female audiences, just as Rosa Giorgio pointed out and found out in her research. To quote two other comments by viewers, the Philosopher podcast says, a corny example about his wedding, dancing with his wife, maybe to please his female audience. That is so sexist. Such a shame, so many older male academics still espouse this sort of sexism in their teaching. And then Monotone Mark says, this is just Hans being a boomer, unfortunately. First, I don't like to be addressed as Hans, prefer Georg if you use my first name. But basically it's interesting that I said much shorter, but in essence the same thing as Rosa Giorgio. But I don't think any of Rosa Giorgio's readers would perceive her as sexist. But apparently a lot of viewers perceived me in that way. So why are viewers like Dr. Philogong podcast and Monotone Mark are making these statements and calling me sexist? Well, frankly, I think that's an effect of wokeism that I described in earlier videos. Namely, this kind of wokeist prejudice towards, for instance, me, makes them not get the, I think, rather obvious feminist point that I was making, as well as I also think the rather obvious media critical, commodification critical point I was making. They completely missed that. Instead, they took it wrongly as a sexist remark and then used actually ageist language to criticize me. That is, they implied an identity politics format to interpret what I say and then used the same framework in order to make a direct personal accusation against me based on my gender and age, which I think totally fails to address any of the points I was making. That's why I call wokeism a sort of civil religious phenomenon, and why I also call it not leftist. Now the most important point: weddings, sincerity, and profilicity. Let's look at another critical comment by a viewer. Alaron writes, "There's nothing unbelievable in the notion that a moment of his wedding, when he got married to the woman he loves and was surrounded by friends and family, was a moment of true happiness and meaning for him, and one that he would gladly relive in a cycle of eternal recurrence." Fortunately, one of the viewers commented on this comment in turn and said, the name is Sway, "No one said it was unbelievable." Yes, I didn't say it was unbelievable, and I didn't say it was dishonest. What I was implying was that he was prolific. Let me explain that further. And let's look at very quickly at another viewer's comment. CF says, "What if he, PewDiePie, just sincerely meant it?" Well, my whole philosophical point is, today we are, especially on social media, but by no means only there, truthful in the mode of profilicity and not in the mode of sincerity. When representing our wedding on social media, we are truly invested in it. Let's look at another feminist paper on weddings. In a paper titled "Traditional Inequalities and Inequalities of Tradition, Gender, Weddings, and Whiteness," Julia Carter writes, "While wedding traditions may have become increasingly reflective of democratic choices, they retain traditional inequalities in their representation and conceptualization." So, what sort of traditional inequalities do weddings retain? Well, again, traditionally, and Nietzsche already pointed to this, weddings represent a public identification with traditional roles, gendered roles, wife and husband. They publicly demonstrate a sincere submission and internalization of these roles. So I assume that in the past, when people under the conditions of sincerity had their weddings and celebrated them and memorized them, they would truly and honestly identify with the moment of their wedding, but they did so in the mode of sincerity, which is, for instance, as Nietzsche pointed out, very different, for instance, from an authentic identification with something, but it's not less honest. So, simply put again, traditional weddings are initiation ceremonies under the regime of sincerity, and they are experienced in an honest, sincere way. Now, I assume that actually PewDiePie's wedding and PewDiePie's identification of his wedding doesn't operate in the mode of sincerity as I just outlined it. I don't think that with his wedding, even though I don't know it, but I just assume it, that PewDiePie and his wife were not celebrating their initiation into traditional role-oriented husband and wife identities. I think they probably don't affirm the submission of women to men and similar things that were traditionally associated with that. Also, differently from a traditional representation of weddings, of course, at the actual wedding, PewDiePie was just within probably a small circle of friends and family. But when we learned about it, when watching PewDiePie's video, he was no longer in that mode. He was communicating that very moment to a huge audience of hundreds of thousands of people whom he does not know. So he was representing this very moment intentionally within a Profilicity framework where it contributed not to his sincere adoption of the role husband, but to the creation of the PewDiePie profile to a mass audience, his general peer. It was in the context of this video, the reference to his wedding, part of his identity making, part of his self-making. So interestingly enough, again, he was not talking about any kind of private moment with his wife that he wanted to relive ever and again. It was not in that strict sense an authentic moment between two individuals, but he was talking about the wedding dance as it was seen, observed in the midst of his friends. So he's talking about what is in effect a planned, a staged performance. So there is both the ritualistic planned element to it, as well as the exposition, being seen element to that scene. In effect, what he's talking about is a perfect illustration of what I like to call the picturesque. To perceive something in terms of its previous representation in the form of a picture. I like to refer to landscape paintings to illustrate this. This is how the term was initially used when people began to see actual landscapes through the lens of landscape paintings they had seen before, and then judge the beauty of the landscape they saw in relation to the pictures of it. So you see something in terms of how it's being pictured, of how it's being looked at. And PewDiePie does the exact same thing with his wedding dance. The wedding dance in itself is one of the most picturesque scenes in contemporary culture. So again, this is not at all, in Nietzschean terms, a moment of authenticity. It's a moment of picturesque profilicity. The picturesque wedding dance is the moment in the mode of profilicity. The whole point now is that there is no dishonesty in it. Just as under conditions of sincerity, the moment of the wedding dance could be experienced sincerely and in this way genuinely, a dance with someone can be experienced authentically and in this way honestly, and it can be experienced and reproduced prolifically, and there is nothing dishonest to it. It's just a different mode of honesty. So what under the conditions of sincerity is sincere commitment to roles becomes, under the conditions of profilicity, true investment in a profile. PewDiePie, in his video, presents the memory of his wedding dance to the general peer as a part, an element of his profile creation. And this is also how it's being validated then in feedback loops. The viewers, as the people who commented on my video, actually confirm the truthfulness of PewDiePie's experience back to him, just as it happens in Sincerity. And they actually also reproduce the same truthfulness in their own enactment of other weddings, their own weddings that they then post pictures of on social media. So this is part of a mutual identification, confirmation in the mode of profilicity that enables honesty, that enables true investment. So we can say that today a wedding is an initiation ceremony under the regime of profilicity, and it helps building identity in the form of profiles.